It's November 1st, and of course, November 1st is most important because of what happened in 1974. I happened. But in 1512, something that I guess is also important happened. That is, the Sistine Chapel was opened to the public for the very first time. After 4 years of work, the great Michelangelo had finished his painting of the ceiling of the chapel, and this was available to be seen. And it's an amazing work of art, no question, especially since Michelangelo always considered himself a sculptor and never really even wanted to do this, but was kind of forced to by the Pope. And of course, he did his very best and painted this iconic ceiling, probably the most famous of which is the creation of man scene. And anyway, what's interesting is a little over 20 years later, he also was going to paint that Last Judgment wall. And of course, the most amazing part of this was the restoration that was done from 1980 to 1999 that totally changed our view of it. It's November 2nd, but in order to understand what happened on this day just 1 year ago in 2022, we got a flashback to 1945. World War II in Europe had just ended, but the missions weren't over, as there were B-17s and other planes that were still delivering supplies. And one of these planes, a B-17, went down in the Alps. And tragically, all 17 American airmen on board were killed in this crash. One of them was a man named Russell O'Rourke. Flash forward to more recently, the crash site was discovered. And in 2021, there was an organization that tries to reunite families with artifacts. And they were out there with their metal detectors, and they found something amazing. They found a bracelet with the name Russell O'Rourke. They found some buttons, and were eventually able to get in contact with the man's nephew, who shares his name in Mesa, Arizona. And they sent those items to him. He received them on this day in 2022. It's November 3rd, and on this day in 1957, a major milestone in the space race took place. Laika, the first living thing to survive in space, was launched by the Soviet Union. Now, Laika's story is an amazing one and a tragic one all at the same time. Laika was a stray. She was apparently a dog that barked a lot. In fact, the name Laika means barker, and that name was given to her by the Russian public because when she appeared on television, she barked a lot, and so they started calling her Laika. Now, Laika's mission was doomed from the start in the sense that this was a suicide mission, but she didn't have a say in it, and she was in a very cramped space. They were only able to put enough food, one meal up there for her, and she probably only lived a few hours. The heat shield eventually failed. She had limited movement, and she tragically passed away in space. It's Monday, November 6th, and on this day in 1917, you have this Bolshevik coup where there's this Bolshevik overthrow of the Russian government, and you have this Bolshevik leader, Vladimir Lenin, with his Bolshevik minions, Trotsky, Stalin, and it's a Bolshevik takeover. Really, the whole thing is Bolshevik. Or is it? Because the word Bolshevik means part of the majority. And in reality, it's a coup. They were not in the majority, this Social Democratic Workers' Party in Russia. But anyway, this is, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin. Now, it's also known as the October Revolution, which you might notice it's November. Big surprise, Russians were backwards and behind the times on something, and they were still using the Julian calendar. And so to them, it's the October Revolution. In reality, it's November. It's Tuesday, November 7th. And on this day in 2014, love was in the air. 79-year-old serial killer, life in prison, Charles Manson obtains a marriage license to wed 26-year-old Star Burton. Now, let's face it. For her, this is obvious. He checks all the boxes. Serial killer, check. Swastika on forehead, check. Life in prison, check. I mean, he hits them all. But sadly, it doesn't end up taking place because at some point he realizes that she perhaps is going to use his corpse for, monetary purposes, some kind of a sideshow. I don't know who would be attending this. Weird people out there, I guess. So unfortunately, they never do tie the knot. And I don't really want to get into either of their heads to know exactly why. It's Wednesday, November 8th. And on this day in 2020, a very sad event took place. Canadian-American game show host Alex Trebek passed away after a 20-month battle with pancreatic cancer. Now, of course, he's best known for his 37 years hosting the show Jeopardy from the moment of its revival in 1984 until his death. And I grew up on this show. I used to watch it all the time, and it's a big reason why I love trivia so much. And of course, the show has continued with actress Mayim Bialik, and of course, many time Jeopardy champion Ken Jennings now hosting the show. Of course, the format is a little corny with its answers and questions, but it's been featured brilliantly on Saturday Night Live. And my favorite featuring of it, of course, is in the movie Groundhog Day, where Bill Murray impresses everyone at the bed and breakfast by knowing all the answers. So long, Alex Trebek. It's Thursday, November 9th. And on this day in 1989, perhaps the most significant historic event of my lifetime took place. Yes. This is the opening of the Berlin Wall. Now, the Berlin Wall was the symbol of the Cold War. It was the symbol of the Iron Curtain that divided East from West. And I grew up basically believing that at some point we were going to have World War III and we would be fighting against the communist forces of Russia. And then suddenly the Cold War was over. And even though it didn't officially end this day, this is, of course, the day that was the beginning of the end, where there was no going back. And I've had the opportunity to visit Berlin, Germany, just in 2022 and see the remains of the Berlin Wall and see the remains of Checkpoint Charlie. And it's an amazing experience. It's Friday, November 10th. And on this day in 1865, Henry Wirz was executed for crimes committed while he was commandant of the infamous Andersonville prisoner of war camp during the Civil War. Now, what's interesting about all of this, Wirz was originally from Switzerland, came to the United States, ends up eventually in Louisiana, had a few other stops along the way, and ends up as an overseer on a plantation. And so this guy had experience when it comes to this sort of ruthlessness, you might say. And Andersonville was a horrible place. About 45,000 Union soldiers in total were imprisoned there over the time that the camp was opened. Nearly 1/3 of them died in that camp, 13,000. Lack of water, lack of food, lack of shelter were all a big part. And Henry Wirz pays the price. It's November 13th, and on this day in 1982, just 2 days after Veterans Day, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. was dedicated. Now, I think that there's a misunderstanding as to how these things come about. I think people think, well, the government decided to make a memorial. And that's sort of true, but these things almost always start with an individual. And that individual, in this case, was Jan Scruggs. He was a Vietnam veteran. He'd seen buddies die in action. He'd seen the struggles after they got home. And he wanted to build a memorial that was both for those who died and for those who'd survived the war. And it was a long process. And there were 1,421 designs that were submitted. And the one that was chosen was by Maya Lin. She was a 21-year-old undergraduate student at Yale University, and she had the winning design. And there was one absolute requirement in this design, and that was that every single name of everyone who died in that war would be featured on this memorial. And that's the case. It's November 14th, and on this day in 1881, Charles Guiteau was put on trial for the assassination of U.S. President James Garfield. Let's get some backstory here. Garfield was a Republican. He was elected in 1880, so he took office in March of 1881. Guiteau was also a Republican, but he was very deranged. He believed he had been chosen by God to save the Republican Party by killing the president. In fact, when he was captured, there was a letter in his pocket that detailed all of this. He had been stalking the president for months, and on July 2nd, 1881, he had the perfect opportunity. It was at a train station, and Guiteau fired twice. The first one grazed the president. The second one struck him in the back, and the president fell to the ground. Now, here's the problem. That bullet, they were never able to find it, and they were never able to dislodge it. And that is why that bullet killed James A. Garfield. It's November 15th, and just 1 year ago today, all that Tay-Tay drama went down. Yes, it was the Eras Tour concert ticket sale, and it was crazy. And if my house is any indication as to how these things went, There was a lot of drama. Now, fortunately, my daughters managed to get their Tay-Tay tickets, but not everybody did. Uh, and it just makes me think back to, my own youth. And I remember a number of times sleeping out, camping out at a supermarket. Yes, Gen Zers, a supermarket. Uh, in the parking lot just to try to get tickets for a big concert, or spending hours on the phone hitting redial. Things have changed, but have they changed for the better? I don't know. And you know what? I guess the only way we'll find out if things have really changed is the next time Taylor Swift has a big concert tour. It's November 16th, and on this day in 1532, Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro kidnaps Inca Emperor Atahualpa. And this, of course, leads to the eventual overthrow of the Incan Empire. Now, how does this all happen? Well, 11 years earlier, Cortez had conquered the Aztecs. And Cortez writes a book about this. And because modern printing had been invented less than 100 years earlier, Pizarro is able to read Cortez's account and use the information he gleans from that to figure out how to take on the Inca Empire with just 180 men. It's really an unbelievable story. And it's, I think, best chronicled in a documentary series called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Episode 2 is the one that features this. And there is a video guide in my TPT store that can go along with that. I highly recommend it. It's November 17th, and on this day in 2003, Arnold Schwarzenegger became the governor. It's an unlikely moment in American history. But yes, this happened. And it was only the second time in U.S. history that a governor of a state had ever been recalled. The first time way back in 1921. Now, how does this happen? Gray Davis was the governor. He was facing major state budget issues and a lot of unpopularity because of electricity brownouts. And alas, there's a recall. And Schwarzenegger emerges. But maybe the best part of this whole recall situation came to us because of Saturday Night Live. Yes, one of the greatest recurring episodes, skits in history, the Barry Gibb talk show. Its very first episode featured this election campaign and, of course, the singing in of Cruz Bustamante. It's November 20th, and on this day, Elizabeth marries her distant cousin, Philip Mountbatten. And, of course, we all know all about this because of The Crown, which is, of course, 100% historically accurate. No liberties. Now, Elizabeth, when she was young, didn't expect to ever become the monarch because her uncle was the king. And then, of course, Edward abdicates, and her life changes when she's 10 years old. Now, 3 years later, she and Philip meet for the first time at a wedding. She was 13, he was 18. And then 8 years after that, the two of them marry. They have children together, Charles and Anne, and then everything changes because George VI, her father, dies. She's just 25 years old. Interestingly, the first Queen Elizabeth back in the 16th century was also 25 years old when she becomes the queen. And the two of them live 73 years together, both well into their 90s. And Philip and Elizabeth. It's November 21st, and on this day, Thomas Alva Edison unveils one of his greatest inventions, the phonograph. Now, he was young at the time. This is his first big invention. He's just 30 years old, and people already start calling him the Wizard of Menlo Park. Now, what's the first thing that he recorded? Well, it was Mary Had a Little Lamb. Anyway, there's a famous recording of him later in life saying that. But that was the first thing he ever recorded. Now, how does this change things? Well, every bit of music that I've listened to in my life, pretty much, is thanks to the phonograph. Now, he goes on to have many other inventions, 1,000 patents, but two other huge ones. The light bulb, which changes everything, and motion pictures, which change everything. And of course, you wouldn't be watching me today if not for Thomas Alva Edison and those three big inventions, because YouTube is 100% dependent on electric light, motion pictures, and recorded sound. It's November 22nd, and on this day, in fact, 60 years ago today, JFK was assassinated. This happens, of course, in Dallas, Texas. Why is he in Texas? Well, because he knows Texas is going to be a big swing state in the 1964 election. So he's getting a head start on that. And he goes through the city. He reaches Dealey Plaza, and it's from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository that shots are fired. The suspected assassin who works there, Lee Harvey Oswald, is eventually arrested. But questions remain. Was there a second shooter there on the grassy knoll? Did Oswald work alone, or was he part of a larger conspiracy? The Warren Commission says that Oswald worked alone, and I suppose we'll never know. There's probably some conspiracy theorists you can talk to who can tell it all, but I don't think we'll ever know. But what we do know is how this affected the nation. It was a tragic moment that changed everything. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Today is November 23rd, and on this day in 2017, it was the second year of a wonderful tradition that's been celebrated online as Wanda Dench and Jamal Hinton had their second Thanksgiving dinner together. Well, how did this all get started? Well, back in 2016, Jamal receives a text from someone who claims to be his grandma, who's not his grandma, inviting him to Thanksgiving dinner. Once they sort that out, she says, well, why don't you come anyway? And so he comes to Thanksgiving at Wanda Dench's house right here in Arizona, and they enjoy a great meal together. And the two of them become very close, and they have continued to help each other through situations in life. And year after year, the two of them share a Thanksgiving meal together, although not always on Thanksgiving itself. And in 2020, Wanda loses her husband, and Jamal is a big part of helping her get through all of that. And this year, for the 8th time, they met again on Monday of this week. It's November 24th, and on this day, in fact, 60 years ago today, just 48 hours, almost exactly after JFK's assassination, his suspected assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, is killed by Jack Ruby. Well, how in the world does this happen? Well, Oswald was being held in the basement of a Dallas police station. He's being moved to another location. And the Dallas police want to show the world that they are not mistreating this famous prisoner. And somehow, and this is the biggest question maybe, Jack Ruby gets into the basement along with the press with a loaded handgun and moves forward and kills Oswald. Well, why did he do it? This is a conspiracy theorist field day. Well, he was a nightclub owner. He had some connections to organized crime. He always said that he did it to help Jackie so she wouldn't have to go through the pain of a trial. But I guess we'll never know because he dies just 3 years later in prison. It's November 27th, and on this day in 2015, the famed Spanish treasure galleon, the San Jose, which was sunk in 1708, was found off the coast of Colombia. Now, the contents of this ship are believed to be worth as much as $20 billion. It was part of the Spanish treasure fleet that was heading back to Spain from the New World. And if you grew up in the 80s and played Sid Meier's Pirates, you know you hit the treasure fleet every chance you get. Anyway, the British do. The problem is they sink the ship, and the treasure sinks to the bottom of the Caribbean. A group of American investors, 100 of them, including the famed actor Michael Landon, they send a group to try to find this. They negotiated with the Spanish government, and they find it, we believe, in 1981. But the courts overturn all of this, and so it's a big question as to whom it belongs to. Then in 2015, another American salvage group discovers it using a robot, and the question is, who does it belong to now? It's November 28th, and on this day in 1954, the great physicist Enrico Fermi dies of cancer. He was Italian, and he was a professor at the University of Florence, and his work earned him a Nobel Prize in physics. But this is the 1930s, 1938, and it's Mussolini's fascist Italy. He is given special permission to go, and he and his wife travel to Sweden. He accepts the award and then defects to the United States. Keep in mind, he hates the fascists, and his wife is a Jew. It's there that he becomes a part of the Manhattan Project with the famous J. Robert Oppenheimer. And under Stagg Field, the football stadium at the University of Chicago, in 1942, he produces the first controlled nuclear chain reaction. And this is a huge moment, of course, in history. And tragically, like so many others that worked on this stuff, he dies young. It's November 29th, and on this day in 1985, the painting Woman Ochre by Willem de Kooning is stolen from a museum. This happens in Tucson, Arizona at the University of Arizona Art Museum. A couple enters the museum. The woman distracts a security guard. The man goes upstairs and cuts the painting out of its frame. 32 years later, in 2017, the painting is purchased at an estate sale in New Mexico by an antiques dealer. And this antiques dealer, he is offered $200,000 for the painting. And so he starts to think, maybe this is more than I thought it was. And so he does some research and discovers the origin of the painting. He contacts the University of Arizona and returns it to them. The painting was badly damaged in those 32 years. And so it's restored by the Getty Museum in Los Angeles and then finally put back on display at the University of Arizona in 2022. It's November 30th, and on this day in 1874, Winston Churchill was born. Of course, most know Winston Churchill as basically saving the world from the Nazis back in World War II. One of my favorite places to visit in London is the Churchill War Rooms. Definitely recommend that. But I want to talk a little bit about the younger Winston Churchill, back at the time of World War I. So he becomes the head of the British Admiralty, which is essentially the head of the British Navy. And he is in fact at the helm of that when the Titanic sinks in 1912 and when the Lusitania sinks in 1915. But he's best known in that role for the failed Gallipoli campaign. This was an attempt to invade the Ottoman Empire, and it goes very wrong, so much so that he loses his job. So what does he do to restore his reputation? He goes into the army and fights in the trenches of World War I. Do you want to see some more of Mr. Lewis? Of course you do. You're addicted. There's a great video here, another great video here, and you can subscribe right here. Do you want to see some more of Mr. Lewis? Of course you do. You're addicted.